Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. As the director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies, it's really a pleasure to welcome you and our distinguished guests here. This is the opening event in a day and a half of our annual meetings of the advisory board of the Institute. We like to start with a public event like this one to involve the community in conversations that we're going to be having over the next 24 hours or so. And it is especially gratifying to me to be beginning with this particular theme and these particular guests who are helping us to explore it together. The theme of human development is and always has been one of the core themes of the Kellogg Institute since it was founded 30 years ago. But over the decades of its growth and development as an academic unit, while the area of expertise of the faculty fellows of the Institute in democracy, democratization, and Latin American studies has far outstripped the other areas of concern to the Institute. Our studies and our preoccupation with human development have lagged a bit behind that, and that's something that we're trying very hard to overcome now by renewing the emphasis which was there from the beginning in human development studies. The Kellogg Institute received a great boost in this effort a few years ago with the support of the Ford family, who helped to establish the Ford Family Program in Human Development Studies and Solidarity. And now the question is, where do we go next from here? So our guest tonight, Ken Hackett, is an ideal interlocutor to ask this question. How can the Kellogg Institute move forward? How can the university as a whole advance in its commitment to the area of human development? And how can it, through this area, make a real contribution to the good of the world around us? Ken, as you all know, is the immediate past president of Catholic Relief Services, which itself is a major partner of the University of Notre Dame in the work of human development. His wealth of personal experience leading one of the world's most effective and efficient relief and development agencies is well known. Ken is a native of West Roxbury, Massachusetts. He graduated from Boston College, one of the facts that we will forgive him, and enrolled in the Peace Corps because, as he has said, quote, "It seemed like an interesting thing to do." He was assigned to serve in Ghana starting in 1968, after which he joined Catholic Relief Services in 1972 and started his career with that organization in Sierra Leone. He served in subsequent years in posts throughout Africa and Asia, as well as in a variety of positions at CRS headquarters, including being regional director for Africa during the period when he was called to guide Catholic Relief Services' response to the Ethiopian famine of 1984 and 1985. He supervised operations in East Africa during the crisis in Somalia in the early 1990s. As the president of Catholic Relief Services from 1993 until 2012, he was in charge of operations in more than 100 countries with a global staff of nearly 5,000 people. He retired from Catholic Relief Services earlier this year to be succeeded by the former dean of our own Mendoza College of Business, Carolyn Wu, and was honored this past May with the Laetare Medal, the highest and oldest honor given to American Catholics. Ken, we're very grateful to have you here. Thank you. After Ken's remarks, we'll have a brief response and commentary by Ray Offenheiser, member of our own advisory board of the Kellogg Institute and the president of Oxfam America. Oxfam America is a nonprofit international development and relief agency, the affiliate of Oxfam International in the United States. Since Offenheiser joined this Boston-based organization in 1995, it has grown sevenfold and become a leader on an array of public policy issues, international development, human rights, in the environment. Previously, Ray served for 5 years as the Ford Foundation representative in Bangladesh, and prior to that in the Andean and Southern Cone regions of South America. He has directed programs for the Inter-American Foundation in Brazil and Colombia, worked for Save the Children Federation in Mexico. He serves and has served on numerous boards and advisory bodies for a diverse array of both national and international institutions. Ray, thank you for your service on the advisory board of the Institute and for your presence here today. And as you can all see, between our two guests, the range of experience over a broad period of time in different kinds of relief work in different geographic areas is really enormous. We're very, very privileged to have two such distinguished guests here today. Please join me in welcoming Kellogg.
Thank you, Paulo. It's a privilege to be here, and I thank you very much for inviting me. It's getting to feel like home, and it's nice. Well, let me start. I think, or I can imagine that most of you don't follow very closely the news from the Vatican. You probably don't read the Vatican website every morning, unless there's a real juicy tidbit or some guy stole papers from the paper, you know. But some of you may be aware that last month there was a very major meeting in the Vatican. The topic was the new evangelization. And that's actually a pretty big thing. Let me not lead you astray. They were not talking, as I understand it, about a new proselytization, a new effort to get rice Christians. Rather, it's about a new energy towards the revival of faith in the context of today's culture. So when asked to conjure up or muse about the future of Kellogg and a future about Notre Dame's deeper engagement in international human development, I thought the Synod, which is going to define the actions of the Church for at least one generation or more, should be brought into the thinking around here. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not going to get into a theological or philosophical discussion. That's not my competence, nor my brief. Rather, I thought I would offer the views of a friend of mine and an insightful Vatican observer and somebody who some of you may know, John Allen, and take his commentary on the Synod as kind of a jumping off point. My objective is to emphasize a context in which to situate your thinking about international human development and whatever agenda rolls out on that. Then I'll lay out a series of suggestions on practical ways to proceed into an area where Catholic Relief Services has spent considerable energy over the years. That is, international human development from the perspective of the Catholic Church. And finally, I'll be bold enough to make some wild and different suggestions on areas you might pursue. Let me begin with John's characterization and the summary of the general inputs by continent. Each of the delegates to this Synod got like 6.5 minutes of time, so they can't roll out a big agenda. From Africa, the Episcopal voices at the Synod echoed a call for the Church's engagement in peace and multiculturalism and justice in economic growth, and a concern about the presence of radical Islam. From Asia came a different kind of voice, a plea for humility, respect for others, and silence. The Latin Americans recognized that popular piety exists across the region, as do base communities, which function as an acceptable pastoral model to reinforce the faith. So Latin American countries consider that it finds itself in a different place than the other two continents. North American and European inputs, as you may suspect if you follow the politics and church and the mixture of the two, had an orientation towards secularism in society. I actually haven't seen the inputs from Middle East and North Africa, but it's not hard to figure out what they were about. And that is the focus on the condition of Christians and the future presence of the church in those areas. I'm not going to talk at all about Middle East and North Africa. But as you are aware, I think many of you are aware, Sub-Saharan Africa, while experiencing significant macroeconomic growth in many places, growth rates above 6, I think there's a couple of countries with growth rates above 7%. In economic terms, the countries continue to be plagued by inter-ethnic, tribal conflicts, unchecked rebel groups in the Congo, Central African Republic, and Sudan, radical Islamists like the Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, or the Ansar Dine who have taken over Timbuktu. Actually traveled to Timbuktu in 1969. So, for the African church, peace is often the absent reality. But another plague, corruption, sometimes state-sponsored, challenges the church to insert itself and its voice of truth on issues of control and use of, let's say, mineral wealth and the direction of poverty alleviation programs. In Asia, the church generally finds itself as a minority religion, and their call for humility and respect for others and silence, to me, captures their reality well. In countries with a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Muslim majority, Christians find they have to walk a very thin line in expressing their concerns without antagonizing the major faiths. But in spite of this cautious posture, they continue to be a voice for the concerns of justice and peace and the betterment of the poor and marginalized. In Latin America, the recognition of the strength of the base Christian communities and an extant piety offer a real firm base to deal with the broader human development challenges. So, as Notre Dame strives to evolve an international strategy that is at once Catholic, that embodies the principles of Catholic social teaching, and that creates linkages with the local church and other institutions, particularly Catholic institutions, I would suggest that Notre Dame and Kellogg and Kroc and many of the other elements in this university have to take into consideration many of these views and realities which the church leaders have identified as part of the new evangelization. And the final conclusion of that meeting has not been promulgated yet, so it may take different directions. But as I see it, Catholic universities, like Catholic charitable organizations, are a critical part of whatever that new evangelization, wherever it heads. My second point is that to positively affect human development, as defined in Catholic social thought and described in Populorum Progresso, and more recently in Pope Benedict's Caritas Deus Est and Caritas in Veritate, and human development as defined by those like Amartya Sen, who was here on this campus, I think, 8 months ago, great economist, who that human development is very complex. It ain't easy. It's something that you've really got to wrestle with. There is a British economist by the name of Owen Barter who heads up the European office of the Washington-based Center for Global Development, and whose ideas I quite admire. He states that the traditional ways of looking at development have generally measured the wrong things, and that historic development efforts have failed to recognize the complexity of the process of development. He calls for a development approach which should be closer to the approaches taken in biology and physics, in which it recognizes that economic development, and I would also suggest human development, is dealt with as a complex adaptive system. He posits that the process of development evolves as interventions take place. Failure happens. Corrections and adjustments happen. and the systems and processes adapt. So don't just measure it in economic terms, as has been done repeatedly for the last 40 years. It seems to me that Notre Dame could make a real contribution over time by studying and documenting some of the non-traditional approaches to human development. Operational research, if you would, but basically looking at things like integral human development. The focus on the dignity of the individual. People here on campus, I know, have been thinking about how to approach the process of research in human development. And one paper I read said some have suggested splitting things into 4 key areas of particular university excellence. So that would be economics and human development, democracy and human development, religion and human development, community engagement and human development, and then kind of looking at things and operating the research agenda in those 4 blocks. I would posit that even this type of breakdown may fail to grasp the complex nature of what needs to happen to bring about a condition of authentic human development. I believe this is going to be a big challenge for the university. You can support professors working across the globe on their projects. But as you've identified, the linkages across the university are really going to be critical. But you can't even stop there, just on the university. Real linkages with practitioners and people with lived experience are vital. Sending students or sending professors to live in a community in Haiti or Uganda for 60 days, to me, is educational tourism. It's good for the student. It helps the professor get the paper. But what's it do about human development? Very little. Selecting communities that Notre Dame plans to work with or study in an integrated way over time, where research is longitudinal and takes into consideration the changing impacts of interventions and failures and adjustments that are present when you start to accomplish or bring about authentic human development. And I also believe that this great university has connections to real, significant, and trusted assets on the ground that can be and are being mobilized. You have the network of the Religious Congregation of the Holy Cross. Its history, its credibility, and strength in places like Ghana and Tanzania and Uganda. And I know a bit about the CSCs in Ghana, having spent a considerable amount of time there. They're primarily located in the Archdiocese of Cape Coast. Now I'm going to give you an opportunity. Well, the former Archbishop of Cape Coast is now a cardinal in charge of the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace. He's a big shot in church terms. And he's a nice guy. And he is very actively interested in bringing the applied principles of Catholic social teaching into the church in Africa. You could maximize those connections. But I would suggest moving beyond Africa and Latin America. You have CSC strength in Northeast and South India, in Bangladesh. Ray, you must have seen it in Bangladesh. It's an asset that should be used, supported, and fully engaged. And I know that Father Bob and a team traveled out there last March to look at areas of convergence. I believe there are major sociological, political, economic opportunities and challenges in those isolated yet populous areas of Northeast India bordering on Burma. And let me offer one potential suggestion in that area. Burma is set to be the recipient of billions of dollars in Chinese investment over the next 5 years. I think the figure I read was creeping close to $10 billion in 5 years. That's big money going into Burma. One can easily imagine thousands of people leaving Nagaland and Assam and those areas in northeast India and walking across the border to fill the new positions that are going to open up by the hundreds, if not thousands, in the mines, in the extractive industry areas. There'll be opportunities. And what's going to happen? If anybody has followed what's been going on in South Africa over the last month, they know that those shanty towns that grow up around mines become hotbeds of violence and upheaval. And maybe studying this issue a little bit from northeast India about what's likely to happen as people move across into Burma. And I think most of you know that President Obama is going to go to Burma next month. This might be another opportunity. Likewise, there are strong yet aging connections with CSC Religious in Chile, in Mexico, and Peru. And the special initiatives that are already underway by this university in Haiti can easily be expanded. Haiti is really, to my mind, a wonderful example where you're presently engaged pretty broadly, but not Kellogg, and I don't think Kroc, but the ACE program is engaged and is contributing massively to the reorganization and revitalization of Catholic education in Haiti. And Catholic education in Haiti is the primary source of primary and secondary education in that country. Also, the Eck Institute, with its elephantiasis program there, is recognized for its cutting edge and life-saving contributions. Could there not be a place where either Kellogg alone, or with the support of the new Notre Dame Initiative for Global Development, with other Catholic actors and agencies, such as CRS maybe, where you could come together to synthesize and elaborate and promulgate solid interventions in human development that would become best practice for the wider non-governmental religious community in Haiti, which is disparate. Nobody talks to anybody. They all do their own thing. And nobody holds themselves to any standards. I'll bet Notre Dame could offer something there. Let me offer a few other comments about collaboration and linkages. I believe that Kellogg and Kroc can be a glue that bonds different parts of the university together, and that this new initiative for global development that maybe you haven't heard too much about as yet is going to be the propellant that ignites a movement deliberately and forcibly towards global development, towards a global development and research strategy. It will demand a focus and a consciously reinforced effort. Nobody changes very easily, and I can only imagine the deans and the professors that they want not only to see where their parochial interests are being attended to, they want to see a clear path forward, and they want to see where the resources are. But I think all that can be managed. In terms of collaboration and linkages beyond campus, let me talk a bit about international Catholic agencies first, and I'll speak a little bit about Catholic Relief Services experience. CRS's experience with universities, not necessarily Notre Dame, is one that is not a natural fit. Organizations like Catholic Relief Services are, they're not exactly command and control models of management, but they are structured around a set of very strategic and explicit priorities. They're built on long-standing relationships with partners in the country. And those relationships have been honed over decades through agreements and disagreements. You work it out like you do with your spouse. And once you've worked it out, then you've got a way to move forward. CRS has very explicit value behaviors. It defines what the expectations of staff is, not just in performance, but in how you should act, how you should relate to communities and partners. And CRS and many other organizations have a pretty clear authority structure. My experience with universities is that the individual professors often act as independent contractors, motivated by the demands of academia. They often are not experienced or tolerant of partners and local institutions that don't always operate at the same standard of either efficiency or they value different things. And I'll give you a specific example from CRS. We partnered about 8 years ago in a bid for the PEPFAR money, which was the HIV/AIDS money. And we partnered with a major medical research university. And it looked great on the proposal. And we won. And we were the largest recipient of money out of this PEPFAR bucket at the time, $365 million. That's not chump change. And there we started off, and we were operating in 11 countries together, and as we started, we saw that we had a conflict. CRS and its local partners were primarily interested in clinical outcomes and a more integral type of improvement for the patients and their family. Most of the people from the research university, not all, were interested in research outcomes. And it didn't work. And we were batting our heads together and arguing, and it was an 8-year, very difficult marriage. My advice to you as you look towards collaboration outside the university is to take the time to understand and appreciate one another. Be explicit about the operational differences and work at ironing them out. Compensating, mediating mechanisms may be necessary. Again, this to me seems like a perfect and valid role for Kroc and Kellogg, and certainly the Initiative for Global Development, and maybe other parts of the university as well. Let me move to a kind of a different level now. I hold a belief that Catholic colleges and universities, and Notre Dame in particular, have much more to offer public policy than we've seen to date. My experience is that in the area of foreign policy and foreign assistance bureaucracies, they are starved for new approaches, starved. They want different analysis. And in particular, those people in Washington who make and implement policy want at least to know about principled approaches. A good example of a principled approach that was welcomed was the Chicago Council Task Force on Engaging Religious Communities Abroad, chaired by Scott Appleby. Its report offered State Department relevant and timely guidance when the White House and State Department were in search of some new directions in foreign assistance and foreign policy. It hit perfect. The Washington bureaucracy's heads pulled up. They said, oh, this is interesting. You can change policy. I believe that Kellogg, with other branches of the university, could do much more of this type of presentation, directly addressing policy changes. And the think tanks in Washington are dying to host somebody who's going to talk about water and conflict or human development in this way or that way. I mean, that's what happens in Washington. Notre Dame has something to offer there. In fact, I believe it has a lot to offer. And Notre Dame can shape parts of the public policy agenda. Here's another idea. According to the Hudson Institute, just the U.S. religious, NGO, and foundation sector alone sends $10 billion abroad each year. that rivals official development assistance of the U.S. government. And my first observation about this is that there's a tremendous amount of hoopla in Washington talking about and studying aid effectiveness. There's some books out there by Bill Easterly and others criticizing aid. And many agencies have engaged in trying to come up with more effective mechanisms. My first observation is, you know, while there's much ado about official development assistance, there's no ado about the $10 billion a year of private development assistance that's moving. And I believe that Notre Dame could put some research time and attention onto that effort, make some recommendations on how better to manage that type of assistance, and make some recommendations on new standards. Another area. When I served on the board of directors of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which was a new initiative to try to provide foreign assistance in a different way than had been provided for years under USAID, they were looking as one of the principles for deeper country ownership and engagement in defining what it is that they would put their $1 billion into. And the idea was, that's I-D-E-A-R, sorry about Boston, was that idea of country ownership should include engagement in kind of a social accountability way of civil society, various elements of civil society. It never worked. And it didn't work for two reasons. First of all, nobody knew how you engage civil society effectively. I mean, people are now looking for research grants to study Arab Spring, but it's all already morphed into something else. And secondly, the host governments were resistant to having civil society groups in their tent. They didn't want anybody looking over their shoulder. But the fact is, there is growing pressure to look at social accountability mechanisms in more broader ways, and I think that's something that Notre Dame could really offer. Another thought. Climate refugees, uprooted populations, and people on the move need to be figured into any look at development for the next 30 years. Ray was telling us earlier he was at a meeting at State Department on climate change, and there's not much pickup there. But the fact of the matter is, people are going to be affected by floods and landslides and this, that, and the other thing. And it's going to have a major impact on human development. Disaster risk reduction efforts, preparedness, resiliency, coping mechanisms, as well as adaptation to and mitigation from climate change, all will be called upon, and there will be needs for real operations research in relation to these, so as to evolve best practices. I don't foresee Kellogg or the university becoming involved in service efforts. You will be mired, stuck in the mud if you try to get yourself involved in that side of the game. But looking and compiling best practices using empirical data would be extremely useful. Let me come close to the end by offering some challenges of a different magnitude in a different geographic area, the Republic of South Sudan. Some of you may recall there was a visit here in November, this time last year, of some bishops and others from South Sudan to the campus a few months before the referendum that brought about their independence in January 2011. You, as a university, embraced them and embraced their message. And the outpouring of support they felt from the administration, the faculty, and most of all the students, gave them as visitors here to the United States renewed energy. And they repeated that over and over again. And when they left here and went to Capitol Hill and then to meet with the people at the National Security Council, they felt that they had something behind them. And I was told very explicitly by somebody in the National Security Council, that their visit was a game changer for people in the White House. Up until that point, the issue was kind of with USAID. It wasn't really a major foreign policy issue. Yeah, we'll get through the referendum, but if they don't break away, that'll work too. That visit, reinforced by people here, became a game changer. And in July of 2011, they declared their independence and became the world's newest nation. Throughout their 40-year struggle, the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church played an important role in calling for justice and peaceful options. It stood firmly with the people during unimaginable difficulties, and it never hesitated to speak the truth, both to the government in the north and to the leadership of the Sudan People's Liberation Army in the south. The church gained considerable respect in many quarters, and generally the Archbishop and the bishops continue to enjoy that respect from governmental leaders, and their input is listened to. As this new nation struggles with a myriad of problems and challenges, not the least of which is continued tension and fighting with the north, and inter-ethnic battles breaking out in various parts of the south, it's also faced with the challenge of framing a new legal code. They know they're going to have to negotiate the treaty on the Nile. The Nile runs right through Sudan. Last time it was renegotiated was 1959. There was no Southern Sudan. They're going to have to figure out investment regulations and laws. They're going to have to figure out, what do you do about orphan children? There's no law for it. Just imagine what you would do if you were told, okay, your job this semester is to figure out what you're supposed to do to start a new nation after you've been at war for 40 years. I mean, they're struggling with so many problems and challenges. It's just amazing. But there are people who are helping them. The World Bank, UNDP, bilateral assistance groups, they're all in there. And generally, this is the way it works. Proposals are developed, bid, money's allocated to contracts, in contracts to consultants who undertake their assignments. In Southern Sudan, generally, it's with the least amount of time spent in Southern Sudan. And once the contract's completed, a new contract is awarded, new people bid, new consultants arrive, forget about what happened before most times, and there's no relationships built with people in the government or others in society. Or, I won't say no, there's limited relations built. And history gets swept aside. With such an in and out mode among those trying to help this particular government, there's little real vested interest in trying to see long-term results, build trust with Sudanese individuals or institutions. So, my thought was, I attended the independence ceremonies in Juba, Sudan, and coming out of there and seeing what was ahead of them and seeing who the actors were that were going to try to help, my thought was, the Catholic Church has great credibility with this government, which is corrupt, which is inefficient, which is new, which is untrained, but they listen to the Catholic Church. Would it not be possible for a university like Notre Dame to bring the full breadth of its schools and talent, the engineering, the law school, the Kroc, the Kellogg, everything, to the Catholic bishops in Southern Sudan, so that they could offer it to the government of Southern Sudan in a sustained 15, 20-year way, make a commitment and stick with it and bring resources and money and attention. I'm using Southern Sudan just because it's the new nation that I know. There are other places in the world that this could be done as well. Bring the whole university behind something and stick to it. And over time, professors are starting to do their research on this geographic area or this big problem. But small projects are not making the impact. And this university has the capability to make a major impact on human development in the world. Let me wrap up with Ken's dozen takeaways. Number one, actively get into sync with where the Catholic Church is headed in the next decade. Number two, recognize that human development is complicated and will not be solved or enhanced with technical solutions alone. The solutions must continually adapt. They must evolve and be tuned to the communities in their context. Notre Dame can make a great contribution by studying non-traditional approaches to human development, such as integral human development. Number four, authentic human development is not about predetermined technical solutions, but it must engage with people and practitioners. Relationships matter. Exploit the CSC presence. It's natural. Number five, collaboration with organizations like CRS and other international and local institutions is not natural. Take the time to work through it and understand each other. Number six, make a deliberate effort to engage public policy. Look for the areas where Notre Dame can shape the policy agenda in Washington. I don't believe you can shape it from South Bend. So you've got to find new ways to do it. Consider research on non-official development assistance and its effectiveness. Consider research on effective engagement efforts for civil society in social accountability mechanisms. Disaster risk reduction strategies are going to be critical and need additional research. Number 10, consider a more active and robust engagement and training for the church and other leaders in Asia and Africa. Don't try to duplicate what the service agencies already do. Try to complement with them. Don't try to compete with them. Try to complement their efforts. Your powerful research and education/training functions paired with implementing organizations can create immense synergies. Look for the big, sustained programs that can have a transformative impact on many millions of lives. So, Paulo, you asked me to muse and dream a bit. I realize that you're doing far more than what I'm aware of. But the power for good that this university can ignite is amazing. The potential to leverage alumni, Notre Dame families, and students to witness a university actualizing the basis of its foundational beliefs, it's there. The potential to make a lasting contribution to lives of graduates and scholars and policymakers and the church worldwide is within your grasp. And with a winning football team, you can't but lose. Thank you very, very much.
Well, great. It's for me, it's a real pleasure to join my friend, colleague, and fellow practitioner, Ken Hackett, for in sharing some reflections with you all today on his remarks. It's also, I think, I would just want to take an opportunity, maybe as someone who's known Ken for quite some time, and as a sort of a fellow traveler in the world of development practice in Washington, to maybe bear witness to his significant contributions to our work and community over many, many years. You know, he's someone who actually has moved very quietly at very high levels within a number of administrations and within a number of sort of leadership circles of the aid bureaucracy in Washington over decades, and has had, I think, a significant impact in shaping policy and shaping outcomes. And in recent roles on the board of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a new innovative idea that was originated with the Bush administration but has been ambitiously continued with the Obama administration. Ken has played an important role in ensuring that new innovative approach based on kind of the ownership model that Ken was espousing would grow and flourish and be somewhat protected in a Washington, in a nasty Washington bureaucratic environment that's where everyone's after your budget. So he's done a tremendous job, and I just want to sort of take an opportunity to acknowledge that. And I'd also just say, Ken is someone who actually delivers a very strong message with a lot of humility, grace, and candor, and maybe a bit of Boston Irish pluck. And I think he's provided you with a rich array of observations, and as he always does, I've heard him speak before, he always has at least 10 takeaways at the end. In fact, when Carolyn Wu joined the Catholic Relief Services, he and I belong to a CEO group that meets twice a year, and he was invited to offer some insights to Carolyn as she was coming into that new role as kind of part of our after-dinner session, and I think there were 12 takeaways in, too, weren't there? Yeah, okay. So anyway, but Ken's a giant in our field, and it's terrific that he's associated with Notre Dame and with this effort to sort of internationalize your programs. So what I want to do is maybe just take a little bit of time to comment on some of his observations, and I suppose my role should be to be generating controversy by being sort of a provocateur, but the problem is that we're probably more in violent agreement than we are in violent disagreement. So in the interest of sort of creating some discussion, I'm going to try to complement a lot of what Ken said and maybe offer some other perspectives on it. I think first, one thing that's woven through a lot of Ken's remarks, but may not be obvious to all of you, is that the development field is actually at a very critical inflection point. There's a lot of change that's happening within the development field, and I think it's important that all of you understand what the nature of that inflection point really looks like. This used to be a field that was dominated by bilateral and multilateral agencies. It's sort of, so you'd go to country X and, it would be AID and the European equivalents, and that, the development budget was dominated by foreign aid funding coming from those entities. Well, the reality is today, foreign aid as a percentage of foreign direct investment in most countries around the world is declining, and it's declining very, very fast. And all over the world, because of the global economic crisis, aid organizations are slashing their budget. Ken, if he were still in his job, and myself and colleagues, we're up on Capitol Hill fighting with the Appropriations Committee to save the USAID budget from very, very deep slashes. And we came within a sort of a hair's breadth of serious cuts last week with the election. I think the budget will be somewhat protected, but we'll still see cuts. And that's been going on, over the last several years in significant ways. And even the World Bank, with its large scale, is a marginal player today. Finance ministers will choose to accept or reject World Bank money depending on the conditions. That didn't used to be the case. There's a new geopolitics in the world in which we have a G20 and we have what's oftentimes referred to as colloquially as the BRICSAMs, the Brazils, Indias, Chinas, Mexico, South Africas, that are actually starting their own foreign aid programs. And we're now seeing South-South development work in interesting ways and new kinds of sort of, if you will, South-South solidarity in the development field that we didn't see before. And there's dramatic new private investment flows from foreign direct investment, extractive industries, and sovereign wealth funds that are shaping the whole development and horizon across the world in ways that are kind of quite stunning in terms of their scale, in terms of the importance that they have in sort of shaping the future. We see market-led development models, public-private partnerships. This is a sort of new narrative you hear in Washington, and there's a lot of interest in what's called multi-stakeholder initiatives that are that are within the framework of these market-led strategies. We see the role of the private sector, and we see new actors and new funding flows generating a lot of concern. In other words, what does this mean now? With these new actors, what's their intent? Are they sort of really pursuing positive development outcomes for the poorest of the poor, or will their investments actually result in greater social exclusion and potentially greater negative outcomes? There's a great deal of work underway on what you might call global norms to basically oversee corporate performance, for example, within particular industries. And a lot of interest in, if you will, corporate accountability as the corporate actors become more invested in work in many of the developing countries. And just to give you an example, mining companies, for example, and Ken referred to extractive industries, and a lot of us are focused on extractive industries now, both Catholic Relief Services and Oxfam. We both work together a great deal in this area because one of the things that you all can hear, and you may have heard it from Paul Collier, those of you who attended the event in Chicago recently that Paul Collier joined, he's been asked in one occasion, so what's the biggest development challenge of the next decade? And he has said, well, over the next decade there will be several $1 trillion of value dug out of the soils of Africa, and what happens with that money will determine the fate of that continent. And so what do we do about that as a development problem? Not something we've normally or historically had to contend with as an issue as development organizations or practitioners. Major food and consumer good producers are under scrutiny and in some cases assault for negative social and environmental impacts in their supply chains, and are facing sort of challenges to whether they can adjust those supply chains, and are looking for support from organizations like CRS or Oxfam or universities to make changes. Corporations like Coca-Cola are defining themselves as development actors, trying to think about how their marketing strategies actually may be put to good use in delivering social benefit and perhaps global public goods to poor communities in different parts of the world, something you might not have imagined in the past. So there's a lot of change afoot. Ken referred to this discussion about effective development. And this is not a discussion that's only taking place in the United States. It's a global discussion about what are we doing, what have we learned after 40, 50 years of development practice that is working. And if I could boil it down to one word, and Ken used this word, it's really ownership. The notion that much of the development practice over the last 50, 60 years has been about us telling them what to do, how to do it, where to do it, and with what technologies to do it. And what we've learned is good development actually occurs when people own the process, think about, plan, and execute the process, taking risks as they do it, failing sometimes, but ultimately when they succeed, you get development on a secure course going forward. So there's been major summits in Paris and Accra and most recently in Busan, Korea, where this whole concept of ownership has really been championed within the development community, and countries, including the United States, have signed up to this concept. The real issue is, how do you actually operationalize it? How do you make it real? And I just want to underline, Ken mentioned, made reference to the point you had Amartya Sen with you, who actually has been associated with Oxfam over the years as our sort of honorary fellow, and so he's a close friend of ours. When I think about Amartya Sen, and he can be a very difficult read, but for those of you who've taken the course or waded into his literature or even heard him lecture, at the end of the day, when you strip it all away, what it boils down to, it's about agency, it's about human dignity, it's about people taking control and shaping their own destiny. And that positive development outcomes come out of that. How do you do that? And I think in many ways that was the challenge I think that was embedded at the heart of Ken's remarks, is unpacking this ownership concept and operationalizing it. And I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in the social sciences and elsewhere on that particular issue. What it means in the development field, however, for institutional actors that come from outside of the countries where they might be working, is it means that you have to develop new kinds of strategic partnerships, if you will, in which there's mutual respect, rights and responsibilities on both sides, and a certain sense of equity and equality in the nature of that relationship. There has to be a lot of patience and understanding in the way those relationships involved. In the development space, it means shifting leadership for planning and execution to governments, while donors assume the role of strategic partners, and both sides work against explicit timetables and benchmarks. And a good example of this in practice is the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which actually has tried to kind of develop a methodology for actually doing this with U.S. government aid dollars. Interesting to note, the Obama administration, and particularly Hillary Clinton, has really tried to champion and execute this ownership concept in practice. And what it's meant for the aid budget, for example, is that a big shift in funding from U.S. NGOs, U.S. contractors, to government institutions in country. And I think Raj Shah, the head of AIDs, tried to say that he'd like to designate as much as 30% of the aid budget to be direct funding of government programs in country that isn't channeled through U.S.-based intermediaries, which represents an enormous shift for the way they've been historically operating. Another theme I'd like to pick up on that I think was, again, I think reiterated several times in Ken's remarks, and at Oxfam, several years ago we did a branding exercise. We tried to rebrand ourselves, and we were working with all these marketing folks, and they developed a whole new profile for the organization. We were going to roll it out with the staff. So we made some T-shirts and a few other little sort of items to sort of share with the staff. And as a bit of a joke, before we actually launched the new brand, we actually sort of gave out all this material. And the new brand we said it was going to be was Oxfam. It's complicated. And really what we're trying to say is the development work is complicated, and it requires long-term relationships, and it's about, or long-term commitments, and a commitment to deep relationship building over time, well-honed and well-managed through thick and thin and good and bad, and the assumption being that it's not always going to go well and you're going to have some problems. That's not sort of the sort of stories you get in the textbooks about success and failure. All that, there's no literature on that, but that's what those of us who live it, that's what we live. In thinking about complications, I mean, about the complications of development, I think maybe those of us who work on this think that maybe the important work to be done in the future is more about systems and institutions and less about siloed, diffuse, and disaggregated projects that deal with narrow technological solutions. And again, I think this is a point that I think that Ken was trying to make. If we were to sort of challenge ourselves to sort of really think about what matters in many of the countries where we work, it's about, do the institutions work to deliver value to the citizens? That's really, at the end of the day, what's going to matter. I started out in this field as an agricultural specialist, and I've worked in countries all over the world doing international sort of tropical agriculture. And in country after country, we would have successful projects here and there in an isolated way, but if there weren't big, good institutions to actually take them to scale and take them to a national level that were filled with competent people, good leadership, and technically capable people, it didn't really matter what sort of projects we might have in this isolated place or that isolated place. So thinking about institutions, institutional economics, operational, the sort of operational sciences that, and systems thinking in the way that Ken was talking about, I think is really critical. And on this issue of relations with universities, I thought that Ken's observations were ones that I tend to subscribe to too. I mean, I think there's a paradox that organizations like CRS and Oxfam are living in this, with this complexity, and we understand many of these complex linkages within these societies and a lot of the interdependencies. Meanwhile, when we interact with universities and we bring folks from the universities into our world, and then they don't live in it, and they're not accustomed to this sort of complex web of relations that we are living with, they often come with sort of highly defined, narrowly prescribed sort of agendas for research that actually, where there's not a fit. And how to deal with that is really a struggle that requires, I think, patience. Ken suggests patience and listening. I might suggest that, we focus less on sort of the typical American approach, which often is an effort to kind of find a quick fix or to find an innovative technology. There's a lot of funding out there for sort of innovative technologies. But oftentimes what happens is the institutional capacity to deliver the technologies isn't there, so the good ideas, in effect, go to waste. And so it takes you back again, that journey back to the systems, back to the institutions. Ken's focus on policy. Maybe I want to pick a bit on that. And Ken challenges to consider a focus on policy. And maybe thinking a little bit about this notion of effective development and what it might mean for policy. For Oxfam, as we've tried to think about what effective development is in practice, for us it's about effective states, active citizens holding that state accountable, and inclusive markets. And the policy work that one would sort of orchestrate around that concept would be what policies are working in those spaces between the state and the market, or citizens and the state, or citizens and the market, to actually enable that sort of triangle to kind of work in a very effective way for positive development outcomes. And what are the policy tools that are needed to produce the right balance in each national context? And it's going to vary from country to country. In many ways, if I were just to simply define what I think maybe human development is in today's context, I would say perhaps it's about the role of states in delivering basic public goods to their citizens at scale in education, health, and in perhaps environmental services in its sort of basic form. If we were to talk a little bit about, as Ken did, about areas where there's perhaps work in policy that would be important and relevant, and that beg for some focus, I think, at least as we see it in our own organizations. One of them would be what I guess I'd call the provision of essential services, the basic services that people need, education and health and environmental services. And this is going to become particularly challenging in the next several decades for the simple reason that, again, one of these sort of mind-bending statistics, the estimate is that over the next several decades, 75% of the world's population will be living in cities. So we're going to have this highly urbanized global landscape, in which we're going to have to provide water to people. We're going to have to provide transport systems. We're going to have to provide, education services, health services to masses that are going to be moving into these cities. And how are we going to make them habitable? How are we going to make them, places that people can sort of transit? How are we going to make them sustainable in an energy sense? So thinking about those essential services from, with a forward vision toward the future that's going to be a highly urbanized future would be an area that, for example, in your own university context might involve engineers, might involve architects, might involve sociologists, a whole lot of people pull together to think in a big way. And again, I'm talking systems and institutions about how do you organize a transit system, in a large metropolitan area. I had this wonderful experience as a funder for the Inter-American Foundation many years ago of funding a whole set of research studies in Colombia that laid the groundwork for the redesign of the Bogota mass transit system. And these were in 4 or 5, 6 different universities and 3 or 4 think tanks. And the idea was, how can we get better public services to the poor in the poor neighborhoods of southern Bogota? Well, anybody who's been to Bogota in the last decade should marvel at what's going on there. And this was the result of a university. I've worked on at Los Andes, the Javeriana, the National University, and about 4 think tanks. Modest studies. In fact, one of the research groups bought a bus, and they did transit tests all over to test marketability and economics of transit all over of Bogota. So things of that sort. Food security is a critical issue. There's a big debate in Washington about food security. Global stocks are at an all-time low. We have to feed 9 billion people by 2050. A lot of it's not about. One of the interesting things is the debate about food security is often about produce more, it's better seeds. It's not necessarily about better seeds. It's oftentimes about access and equity. The global crisis in 2008 was not necessarily that there wasn't enough food. It was actually people couldn't afford to get it. It was priced out of their reach. Well, so there you've got a market distortion. It's not necessarily about productivity, but productivity is part of the problem. But nonetheless, there's a lot of work to be done in that area. Sustainability issues, the whole issue of global climate change. This is an area where I think a university like Notre Dame in a policy arena could play an enormously important role. As Ken said, I was in a meeting at the State Department yesterday, the first meeting of the Obama administration leadership on climate change post-election. And we were sort of lost in the weeds and talking about the negotiating process. And the meeting got stopped and cold by sort of one of my colleagues who basically said, well, that's all very nice, but there's urgency to this question. This is a critical issue for the world, and you've got to be leading on it. How do we up our game here? What is the messaging going to be? There's a moral challenge here. There's a national security challenge. We're not hearing any of that. And we're finding the administration very sort of slow to act and slow to voice its concerns. I think Catholic Church and the Catholic universities could play an extraordinarily important role in moving this agenda both domestically and internationally, and joining with many other groups that are actually very active on this issue. In the humanitarian space, which Ken referred to in terms of disaster risk reduction and so forth, there is also a big concern among organizations like ours that are frontline responders to humanitarian emergencies that the kinds of disasters we've seen, Sandy just now, but that's domestic. But we responded to the famine in the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Kenya last year. There's been a big famine in West Africa that's been underreported. There were the floods in Pakistan. We're seeing emergencies on a scale and with a frequency that are epic, that are beyond the capacity of the UN system to even grasp and get their arms around. And we're having to rethink the entire global system of humanitarian response. And in order to get ahead of that, we have to be thinking a little bit more preventively about things like adaptation to climate change, or building more resilient sort of societies that can deal with and cope with the effects of climate change. Climate change is here. Those of us who live and work in sub-Saharan Africa, we know it. We see it. It's something we're having to live in an operational sense. And there's enormous need for research on sustainable practices, resilience, adaptation, disaster risk reduction, a lot of operational thinking about how to build national capacity in this humanitarian response arena. And there's not a lot of people doing it. I will tell you 2 things. I'm on the advisory board of a sustainability institute at Cornell. And they're working on climate change and sustainability practices. They're sort of taking this up. And they've built a center which is basically trying to incentivize cross-disciplinary work on precisely these issues. Stanford's doing the same thing. So this is a space you might want to think about. It's under-attended to now, and some of the universities are moving into it. Extractive industries, again, going back to the point I made about the volume of money is coming out of the ground in Africa and what that's going to mean. A lot of work is going into some of us are working on actually the mining industry itself. You might be interested to know that Northwestern University has an innovations network that I'm a part of, and within that innovations network there is a task force working on developing a vision for the future, the mining company of the 21st century, which takes into account environmental practices, sustainability, community consultation, compensation practices, land ownership, all sorts of things that mining companies historically have never actually thought about. This is, again, an untended terrain and ripe for work. And you've got a business school here that has a dramatic history of work in corporate social responsibility and could make an impact in that area. Trade, another area, extraordinarily important, going to be far more important than aid in the future. So where could Notre Dame make a difference? Maybe just to kind of move through some ideas and kind of wrap up. And I offer these comments again with some degree of humility and limited knowledge of all of what the university is about today. I think that you have to start by sort of asking what's your comparative advantage in what is really a highly competitive environment. There is a lot going on out there, and there's a lot of universities that are making changes, shifting and moving into this kind of space. And I'm on a number of these kinds I'm in that space in a number of different universities, and so I'm seeing what's going on. So my comments are offered with, I guess, my knowledge of the competitive space, if you will. If I'm looking at you from the outside, I might say you would lack the disciplinary strength in, say, agriculture, for example, or nutrition, or public health, basic education, or rural development that you might find at a land-grant college like Cornell, my other alma mater. But that being said, I think you have some real strengths that you can play to that I think Ken has outlined much more elaborately than I would hope to. And what are those? Your Catholicity and the moral voice and the Catholic social teachings that can be a foundation of whatever work you do, and how you incorporate that into the exercise of voice, I think can be extraordinarily important. Your human rights strength, your human rights history. This was, I think, maybe one of the first human rights programs in the country here at the Kroc Center. I'm one of the first graduates of that program, I might add. Your history in the corporate social responsibility field is another. Your social science capabilities and your engineering capabilities. So these are areas where you might have comparative advantage. And let me just say a couple of things about each of those. The rights and development area. So what that is about, I'm going back to what I said at the beginning. This is really about unlocking real human development outcomes. It involves promoting agency and a national narrative on social and economic rights. In the post-Cold War era, one of the things that's happened in the development field is the United States and many of us in the human rights community have embraced the economic and social rights agenda, which was actually suppressed during the Cold War years in the West. And this is a whole area that actually, the link between development and the economic and social rights narrative is an exciting field where I think Notre Dame could be a real leader. If you assume a rights perspective on development, interestingly, you might think about poverty in a somewhat different way. Most of the work on poverty has a default definition, which is the absence of public goods. Therefore, your role is provide the public goods, be a delivery agent. Actually, if you take a human rights perspective on development, you might, and we define poverty as social exclusion, which gives you a totally different sort of angle on how you think about the poverty issue. So, in that case, what is really required is how do you redress the barriers that people experience that limit their access to opportunity, or the access to credit, or the access to health, to medicines, or whatever it is that maybe is limiting their opportunities. It does, however, require that maybe you're dealing with things like power asymmetries, or market failure, or discriminatory barriers to full human development, as it were. And again, I think this is, in some sense, the essence of what Amartya Sen was communicating to you earlier this year. And I would also note that just thinking about this rights agenda, there's so much going on that's maybe under the radar for much of the world. But just to give you a couple of examples, the Indian government has enshrined the right to food. And they actually now execute that and deliver on that, or try to, with their global populations. What does it mean to have a right to food? We don't have a right to food in this country. But what would it mean if we did have a right to food? And we took it seriously, and we executed against that. Coca-Cola has approved an internal human rights charter. And my organization dialogues with Coca-Cola about what it would mean what does it mean to actually operationalize a human rights charter in a major global corporation. And so there's a variety of, and then the other maybe final point I'd make on this is there's an interesting debate about should there be a right to development, and what does that mean? And there's a literature on the right to development. And so I think this is an area where Notre Dame has a long history, could really excel and build and be an intellectual leader in shaping the whole global development narrative around and shifting it more toward a rights and agency agenda in the way that a Amartya Sen would suggest. Corporate accountability. Professor Hoch, who was here in the business school many years ago, positioned, I think, Notre Dame as a leader in the field of corporate social responsibility long before it was mainstream in the business community and in the not-for-profit world. This is a field that's exploding on multiple fronts and an area of tremendous opportunity. There are efforts afoot to develop customized norms across multiple industries. There's interesting and innovative research going on poverty footprints of corporate supply chains. There's experimental programs in market-led development and multi-stakeholder initiatives, and a lot of debate about how to reach the bottom of the pyramid and what that means in terms of effective development. So this is an area where you have a history, you could deepen it, and you could connect it with your rights history and your rights narrative as well. A lot of work emerging now we're now into sort of globalization 2.0, if you will, within the sort of the intellectual and research community. And a lot of what's coming out is a concern about the fact that we've seen tremendous strides in economic growth. But there's a lot of questions about the quality of that growth. And there's a lot of questions about the fact that in many of the countries where we're seeing this economic growth, we're seeing dramatic increases in inequality. We're also seeing dramatic decreases in social mobility. The United States, just to take the United States, has fallen from being number 2 in the world in social mobility to number 19. But that's something most Americans don't even know in terms of your ability to sort of access opportunity. This is an area where, again, I think, given your history and rights and your interest in development and your social science strength, you could actually excel. Monitoring and evaluation research. Accountability is a major challenge to all actors in the development field right now. And probably as many of you are aware, there's a kind of a little bit of a phase we're going through right now where random controlled trials are sort of the new sort of preferred research on impact modality that came out of MIT, the economics department at MIT. Now there's programs at Yale, there's programs at Arizona. But there's also a critique of that and a desire that there be, if you will, sort of a pendulum shift toward a balance between that kind of quantitative research on development outcomes and impact and the use of more qualitative indicators of work. I think Notre Dame could be a leader if it actually tried to find what's that middle ground in terms of using good quantitative methods and good qualitative measures in delivering reports on impact on development programming. And finally, in public policy, I couldn't agree more with Ken. This is an area where universities have an enormous opportunity and role to play. And I think it's challenging to think about what that would mean at a university like Notre Dame. And how you would actually execute it. Would you create a school of public policy? Would you embed a public policy major in the arts program? How would you actually do this? I also think it's important to think about, I think as Ken was implying, that if you did do this, it would be important that you have a strong presence in Washington to really connect yourselves with the public policy debates going on all of these issues. And where your students would benefit from day-to-day exposure to policy process and the work of groups like CRS and Oxfam and the think tanks and everybody else in that world that are working day after day on these issues, and where you live it and you breathe it. And I think probably if you were going to do that, you'd probably want to be thinking very carefully about what areas you wanted to focus on in which you had sort of special interests. So those students would have niches to sort of, to attach themselves to in Washington. And they're very clear once you're there, sort of where the opportunities might be. And I also think it might be interesting for you to look at various public policy programs in different universities where the public policy is maybe a program or a course major, but it's not a major school. And I would point you at one is Cornell, for example. I was on a body there which was doing an accreditation analysis of a public policy program at Cornell that was aspiring to be a school, but wasn't. But it's an extraordinarily high-quality program. So you could find ways of doing this without necessarily the kind of Kennedy School investment that some schools have. And then finally, just going back to to Ken's really his strong appeal to you in the opener, which is Catholic social teaching offers an enormous amount of value in public policy debates and informing the kind of issues that we work on. And yesterday, just in that public policy discussion on climate change, imagine a room full of 25 or 30 leading environmentalists in the United States, and what were they asking the State Department for? They were asking them to exercise moral voice. Not a policy voice, a moral voice. This is a moral challenge. It's a national security challenge. And we've got bureaucrats working on it, and they need to be pushed to exercise that moral voice. You have a tremendous capacity to push people that play those roles through the work that the Church does in these areas and through the exercise of the moral voice that the Catholic Church and Catholic universities have. So I would heartily encourage you to use it very, very forcefully. Thank you.
Thank you, both gentlemen. I'm sure I'm not the only one in the audience whose first reaction was, good Lord, the challenges are enormous. But also what is wonderful about what we just heard is that while the challenges are enormous, the other thing that comes through so clearly is how much both of you are convinced to the core that Notre Dame can and should play a role in this, a very important role and a very unique role. And we're very, very grateful for that. We have time for just a couple questions if people have them, and then we can continue over a reception out in the atrium. But at least to begin our conversation, yes, sir.
I'd like to ask Ray a question. It starts his undergraduate years at Notre Dame, way back in the midst of time. And he had a particular interest in Thomas Merton and the community assembly in Kentucky. And given the stresses and strains of having to think outside the box the way he does, looking back, do you ever have any moments where you wish rather you would conduct other things?
Well, Father Burrell, who just left here, it's unfortunate he's not here to hear this, was responsible for me living in Mount Savior Monastery in upstate New York as part of, actually it was a program that the Peace Studies program at that time offered in the midst of the chaos of the late 60s, early 70s, as sort of a way of sort of the students who were involved in the kind of the Peace Studies program and the peace movement on campus at that time to kind of find ground and sort of see an alternative sort of lifestyle. So I actually lived as a monk there for quite a number of months, and it was a very, very sort of formative period for me in which I was able to sort out a great deal of sort of issues, and it was an opportunity to sort of think about and study peace and justice issues from a very unique vantage point. And it was just interesting the other day. I was sort of digging through the basement, and I discovered I kept journals there, and I have like 4 volumes of journals. I was like writing like crazy. And what's happened, I think, subsequently is I sort of went out into the world, and the Benedictines have this wonderful notion in the Rule of Benedict, the Rule of St. Benedict, which is that you can be a sort of a monk fugitatis, or sort of a monk in flight, as it were, so living in the world. And so I've sort of kind of thought of myself as a monk in the world over these many years, and I use the monastic tradition and the monastery as a sort of I think of it as a place I'm anchored to and that I move around in the world from, and I periodically return to. And last summer, I was able to have a wonderful experience of getting to a place that I've wanted to get to for a long time, which is the Christ in the Desert Monastery, which is in Santa Fe. Not in Santa Fe. It's quite a distance from Santa Fe, lost in the deserts of New Mexico. And there's a very large community of Benedictines there. And so I sort of feel like that's my home where I draw spiritual sustenance, and it allows me to confront many of the kind of challenging circumstances that both Ken and I have sort of witnessed in these major humanitarian crises around the world, and where we see a great deal of what is really horrific in the world, but we also are privileged to meet some of the most extraordinary human beings that walk this earth. You know, from the most humble leaders in grassroots communities to people. I was working in Recife, Brazil, with the Catholic-based communities when Dom Helder Câmara was still the Archbishop there, and so I had the opportunity to interact with him, with Gustavo Gutierrez in Peru when I lived in Lima, and with Father Tim in the Bengal community in Bangladesh, where he leads the human rights work in Bangladesh, where the CSC community and where the Catholic community really has been instrumental in creating the human rights community there. And more than anything else, I think probably that work, maybe that the combination of having the peace and justice grounding here and the technical grounding and policy grounding that I got at Cornell has sort of given me the right kind of balance to sort of be in this field and be technically competent, but also sort of focused on sort of the rights and justice dimension at the same time. So, thank you, Peter.
Another question? Yes.
I have a question for you, Hackett. You spoke about Catholicism being a great asset that the university has to offer. Both of you spoke of that. And that one of your suggestions was that the university actively strive to be in concert with the direction that the Catholic Church is headed in the next decade. So my question to you is, where do you see that direction, especially given your opening remarks, speaking about how the conferences of bishops in different regions of the world are seeing challenges that are unique to their region and addressing them maybe in different ways and seeing their role, the church's role in those regions, differently?
Well, I mean, beside the rich tradition and the credibility that the church in many places around the world has amassed for itself, where I see the university is kind of enhancing that credibility, shoring it up, helping with rational approaches. And I'll give you an example. We both talked about extractive industries. And in Cameroon, back in, I don't know, 2008 or something like that, one of the oil companies was going to put a pipeline from Chad up in the north to the sea in Cameroon. And the World Bank was going to finance it. And it was just about that time that we came out with this report called Bottom of the Barrel, Extractive Industries and the Impact of the Poor. The guy who did that report, Ray stole him from CRS, and he hired him.
Best thing I ever did.
It was done by this fellow, Ian Gary, and a professor from Stanford. Okay, so now you've got a report that documents concerns and considerations. Who's going to bring those concerns and the considerations to the government of Cameroon, to the government of Chad, and to the World Bank and the financing agency? What we found is that the cardinal there, Cardinal Toomey, had a sense that something is wrong here, but I don't have the vocabulary. I don't know what to do about it. Can you help me? And we were able to take the study that had been done and the primer that was developed around it and help him and his staff to understand what the issues were. And then carry those issues to Washington, which they did, and carry them to the government in Yaoundé, which they did, and carry them to the government in N'Djamena for Chad. So much so that in the initial outset, I won't tell you the end, they got the government of Chad to agree to set up a reserve fund, a legacy fund, where they would put a portion of the oil revenues. They got the World Bank to agree that certain environmental considerations had to be taken into consideration as the pipeline would impact people's farms and lives and everything else. And that the money that, some of the smaller money that would come to the government of Cameroon would also be set up into a reserve fund. It looked great. Everybody was abiding by the rules. Fast forward 7 years later. Well, the government in Chad was attacked by a rebel group. They said they didn't have money for munitions, so they raided the trust fund. Sad end of the story. But nonetheless, the church's voice, empowered by some research, really was profound in that example. And I think that can be duplicated in many places.
I can just give you a quick example. El Salvador.
On the mind.
With the exploding value of sort of minerals globally, there's a land rush everywhere to get into countries that before had never been mined. And so there's a lot of mining companies trying to go into El Salvador. The problem is El Salvador has a very limited water supply, and it's a very densely populated country. And so under the Arena government, the conservative government, there was a big debate about this, and the Catholic Church got involved, the bishops got involved, and the concern was if the mining companies start doing gold mining in the highlands of El Salvador, and they're pulling off tremendous amounts of water, which they have to do in order to process that gold, what's that going to mean for these poor small farmers downriver? And under the conservative government, they actually passed a law sort of limiting, actually prohibiting mining in the highlands of El Salvador. The Catholic, and in turn, what happened in turn was a Canadian company sued the government for millions and millions of dollars. And that case is still sort of being worked out in sort of international court proceedings. But the bishops actually stood with the Conservative Party. There was an election. The FMLN came in, and they actually supported the same position. And the Catholic Church was aligned with that as well. And then the bishops there were in contact with the bishops in Canada. This is a Canadian company putting pressure on this company in Canada. So this kind of international solidarity. The church is a global network, like some of the sort of NGOs. You have the capacity to sort of move and exercise political power on some of these situations where it's really, really needed, and that kind of solidarity is really critical.
But they don't have the data. They don't have empirical evidence, and they often don't have the vocabulary.
Right.
I think we found that in the peace-building efforts as it began. They had a natural sense of what to do with the Muslim groups in Mindanao, but they didn't know how to approach it in an orderly way. And there's where I think a university can help.
And just to give another example of an area where universities could be playing a role. So one of the things that, coming out of this work that we've done together on this extractives area, there's a real desire for there to be greater levels of transparency in the movement of revenues, because one of the great problems is corruption, as Ken said. And so how do you deal with corruption? Well, transparency. But how do you get transparency? It's not easy. And so one of the things we went about doing with some other organizations is actually working in Congress to produce legislation that requires all mining and extractive companies to disclose all financial dealings with governments anywhere they are operating in the world. This went through, there's a long, interesting story about how this happened. It went through as part of the Wall Street Reform Act, as a tiny little amendment at the back end of that act. And it was like a bomb hit it was a full-page article in the front page of the Wall Street Journal 3 days after the bill went through that, by the way, the oil companies got hit on this little thing. The NGO sort of snuck it in the back door of the bill late at night in the caucus between the House and the Senate. So what's happened subsequently, and this is not something you'd imagine NGOs doing, is that the SEC was under incredible pressure from the American Petroleum Institute not to issue a rule on this, which then would enable the government to actually execute it through the SEC practice and create the compliance arrangements that would be required. A lot of lawyers involved in all this. So Oxfam sued the SEC, and we have to have lawyers, we have to have MBAs, we have to figure out what does it mean for us to sue the SEC to get a rule. So we got joined by your former Senator Lugar and Senator Cardin from Maryland in an amicus brief, and we got the rule. Then the API is now suing the SEC for issuing the rule because they don't like the rule. So we're countersuing the API. So we're so. Now think about this for a moment. Now, Ken and I, we started out in this work when we were doing grassroots development in very remote parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, thinking that the route to sort of justice was through building grassroots capacity. And I think what you're hearing from both of us, maybe as kind of a big picture message, is we've learned that isn't enough. You can't solve these kinds of issues at that level. And you may have to do something as dramatic as sue the SEC or sue the American Petroleum Institute, and find allies to do that with, and have intellectuals and university support that helps us think about how we do that conceptually and take those kinds of big risks. And have the professionals on our staff who are able to help us do that and do it well, do it right, and not foul it up. So this is kind of the new policy work and space that we're operating in that's not, that's, you know, I gave a talk last week at Tufts University, and I said, it's, you know, the title of the talk was Not Your Granddaddy's NGO. In other words, we're different kind of organizations today in terms of the things we're taking on and the things we're doing. In addition to that grassroots work, that everything we do on policy is informed by that grassroots work. We continue to do it, but it's to a higher purpose, and we're operating on multiple levels simultaneously, and we need new competencies and new kinds of capacities to do it. And that's where I think the relationship with universities can be very, very fruitful.
Thank you, Ray, including for revealing to everybody the real visionary, step that the university took in putting a lawyer at the head of the Kellogg Institute. It's all about the new NGO and the litigation strategies.
We're hiring, Paul.
This is a conversation that can and must and will continue long beyond this particular event and even beyond this evening as the university deliberates together how to use our resources in the best way possible. But the contributions that both of you have made this evening are really vital to that conversation, and I'm very grateful for it. Please join me in thanking our guests.
Thank you.
And help us celebrate by joining our reception out in the Great Hall.
Thank you. That was fun.
Oh, great, great.